This audio abstract was created and produced by Arcadis. All statements, opinions, interpretations, and conclusions expressed belong to the individual speakers and do not represent views or policies of the Groundwater Monitoring and Remediation Journal, Wiley Publishing, Arcadis, or any other entities. Natural processes that destroy, transform, or attenuate contaminants operate to various degrees at every restoration site, from the time of first release until closure or attainment of restoration goals. These processes complement active remediation efforts. They are the primary restoration processes relied upon in impacted areas that are not actively treated, and they are relied upon where active treatment is considered complete, but where the ultimate target concentrations have not yet been attained. As such, we suggest in this article that the site restoration life cycle exhibits notable parallels to the healing process when there has been injury or illness to the human body. I've asked Dr. Monica Heintz, who is a co-author of this article, to help summarize some of the main ideas and how a medical analog framework may be useful for practitioners.
Happy to join you, Craig. So the ideas that we came up here were really that both in medicine and in environmental restoration, if we observe natural processes, we can leverage their potential and read their warning signs. And by really observing these natural processes, we can then use a targeted approach to get the appropriate degree of intervention where necessary. We also talk about the parallels in mitigating risks with controls and monitoring in medicine and environmental restoration, and also talk about the concept that no intervention should waste resources or cause a risk that is greater than that due to the impact on its own. And then finally, a really important parallel is fostering trusting relationships with honesty and with a willingness to adapt.
Let's talk a little bit more about terms. I mean, we hear lots of terms like monitor natural attenuation or monitor natural recovery, and we've sort of framed these in this broad category of natural remedies. So how would you describe natural remedies?
So each of the natural remedies that we discussed in the article relies on a combination of natural physical, chemical, and biological processes to reduce or dissipate the massive contaminants in the applicable media. So typically, monitor natural attenuation is considered to be a remedy for groundwater. Natural source zone depletion is a remedy that's applicable to separate phase constituents in the subsurface. And monitored natural restoration is related to the natural processes that are active in sediment environments.
Sometimes the term passive risk mitigation is also used. And how does that complement or contrast with natural remedies?
Yeah, so passive risk mitigation measures are really measures that are put in place to interrupt any potential exposure pathway to contaminants rather than to have the effort towards decreasing concentrations of those contaminants.
So let's move into some of these parallels. Why don't you explain how we observe natural processes to leverage their potential and to read warning signs?
Yeah, so by observing where natural processes are succeeding in restoring health, interventions can be targeted as effectively as possible to mitigate the greatest risks. And further, by observing where natural processes are not succeeding, early action can be taken. So in medicine, this might mean monitoring for vital signs and health indicators and using those to have an early identification of a risk. And then with that early identification, you can then take a potentially smaller and more targeted intervention sooner. And this really translates into environmental restoration by sort of re-examining how we look at the life cycle of a remediation project and not necessarily putting monitor natural attenuation or passive risk mitigation measures as elements that are only at the end of that process, but elements that are considered throughout the life cycle so that they could be fully leveraged. So if you can rely on natural remedies or passive risk mitigation measures to control some parts of the impact, then you can target active intervention where those natural processes or a mitigation measure maybe isn't as effective.
How do you see that playing out in the life cycle of a restoration project from an ideal standpoint?
Yeah, I'd say from an ideal standpoint, we'd be collecting data beginning early in the process. And so we'd be able to evaluate the data over space and time. And there are increasingly powerful methods for looking at spatial data and for bringing together different data streams. For instance, maybe the physical attenuation processes together with some of the geochemical environment considerations. And so we'd really be keeping a close eye on natural processes throughout the life cycle of the intervention. But importantly, on all sides, all stakeholders need to be willing to, take a step if a step is needed, or, and that's both forward and backward. So, that might mean that we admit that there's not enough data to understand a process in an area, and that might involve additional investigation a little bit later in the process than a stakeholder might have thought.
Sort of parallel with that, I think, is controls for risk. So maybe you could talk a little bit about how we also manage risk through various control mechanisms and how we assess those.
Yeah, so this is really the case where taking some sort of active intervention that would realistically reduce the risk would cause potentially greater problems than letting go of some use of a resource. So control mechanisms often think about institutional controls, or really just saying that, maybe that groundwater or surface water in an area can't be used for certain beneficial uses. And of course, that's, always hard to sort of accept just a flat out loss. But it's really important to weigh the pros and cons of the risks. So if restoring a surface water feature to a particular use would require ripping out the entire landscape and ecosystem that would maybe never restore itself, then that's really a greater risk and a greater loss than, maybe the one particular use of a surface water feature or of groundwater.
Yeah, that's a great example. And I think it underscores the parallel between the sort of well-known do no harm axiom in the medical profession and the ways that we could potentially do harm through interventions in restoration. And maybe you could talk a little bit about what a healthy, trusting relationship looks like within stakeholders and also ways to get there if that trust building needs to occur.
Yeah, so I think that trust is really based on a history of interactions. And so it's best to be in a trusting relationship before it's time to have hard conversations. So we really start to build these trusting relationships at the beginning of any project. And we really start to build these trusting relationships by keeping lines of communication open and by engaging each other in the way that we would like to be engaged with, regardless of professional position or any role on a project. So, that's, I think one really important thing is, when you need the trust is when hard questions come up and when decisions have to be made, but that's not necessarily the time when you build trust. You build that trust early on in the relationship. And we could focus on building trust in an adaptive project process by using a couple of strategies. So first of all, I would say committing to transparency. And this could be a little bit difficult because, there are legal reasons and other reasons why stakeholders may not be able to be completely transparent with each other in all situations. But to the degree that it's possible from each stakeholder's position, it's important to commit to transparency. And then next, also creating and supporting a culture in which questions are welcome, but where conversations are focused on solutions and not going down a rabbit hole. And then also setting expectations that interpretations are going to change over time and that as additional data are collected, that there may be changes in a conceptual model needed. And really also accepting that there are no silver bullets, that we have to engage multiple lines of evidence and that this also always involves interpretation. And then finally, putting in the work for effective communication. So really trying to present clear messages to our stakeholders and providing supporting materials that can be effectively used to communicate with others. So each stakeholder in a relationship is going to have other people outside of that relationship that they also need to communicate to. So when we provide materials that are easy for everyone to understand, that helps our partners in these relationships to be able to really show anyone beyond that stakeholder circle what we're thinking and how the project's going to move forward.
So everybody's talking about PFAS now. So how does this new contaminant class that, of course, is becoming a dominating problem in restoration, how does that play into what we're talking to here? What are the opportunities and challenges?
Yeah, so it's really interesting because as a contaminant class, PFAS are particularly well suited for the implementation of a full project lifecycle consideration of natural processes. And that is simply because we're just starting to get into site investigations and into any sort of regulatory mandated cleanup. So really, we have the opportunity to collect a lot of data during the investigation phase and to start to really piece together how the processes of natural attenuation influence PFAS. And of course, this is going to be different than the contaminant classes that we've been dealing with historically. So particularly hydrocarbons and chlorinated solvents are subject to substantial biodegradation. And they're also even subject to some abiotic degradation in the subsurface. However, the PFAS constituents that are most primarily regulated at this time are not subject to microbial degradation themselves by known pathways, and in fact can be formed by degradation of some precursor PFAS compounds. And then sort of as a result of this nature of PFAS, non-destructive attenuation processes require far more detailed characterization. And there aren't a lot of sort of historical data to date that we can, base interpretations of attenuation on. So, for instance, we're not going to have years and years of concentration sampling over time to consider trends because we're just starting that sampling program. And then, also really focuses in on the importance of understanding the physical mechanisms of attenuation. And that really comes down to understanding fate and transport. And so with PFAS, it's going to be a lot more about how these chemical and physical mechanisms work to limit mass transport, and then to understand really the longevity of the sort of the sequestration and the way that PFAS can become sort of tied up in the subsurface.
Monica, this has been a great conversation, and I'm wondering if you have any final thoughts before we close?
I think just in our bodies and in contaminated sites, natural processes really do help to mitigate a variety of perturbations. And having the preferred approach of maintaining and recovering health to allow the body to heal itself with limited and targeted intervention, I think can really help us to pursue the full extent of natural remedies that we can apply for environmental restoration sites.
Monica, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Craig.